Hi, it's Neil and LeBron, and we're here to talk about philosophy. Hopefully, you are too. We're going to talk about the Crito, and I would like you, as I've said in the other videos, to get your uh, book Five Dialogues out and open it to the Crito. It's the best and maybe even the only way to really get engaged and follow along with what I'm saying. So, so the Crito is a tremendously important work. I say that, I know, with everything that we read, which so far has been by Plato and with Socrates as the protagonist. Um, I say it because, and I can say it because, as I said a while ago, Plato is the foundation of Western thought. And so when we read Plato, we're reading the foundation. Everything goes back to Plato. And so the discussions and arguments that we have today in modern thought and in Western civilization is really shaped and structured by Plato and uh, um, the dialogues within which Socrates is the protagonist. The Crito is a short piece. It's about, I think, 13 pages. And it's about political philosophy. It's one of the origins of political philosophy and tremendously influential. I think it's a wonderful work, and hopefully we can, you know, will impart that. We'll participate in that wonderfulness some. Um, you should have in front of you or on your computer or somewhere, a piece that I've written, a short summary piece of what we're going to cover, what I'm going to emphasize, and it says something like important points about Crito, um, and I guess to start off, I want to just say what the 2 points about the Crito are uh, that I like to emphasize and that I think are really really important. Um, the first point that I want to make about the Crito is that it illustrates Socrates' fundamental commitment to acting on principle. And we'll come back to that in a couple seconds. I do want to say the second important point about the Crito is Plato's claim, and it's implied, but it's almost explicit. But Plato's notion that the community is the source of identity, and we've met that before. If you've traveled with me in the introduction to philosophy class, we've met similar formulations of that, of my saying that in, for instance, when we watched the video, the Twilight Zone video, A Nice Place to Visit, I was saying that same kind of thing in a different way, but Plato says it very importantly. The community is the source of identity. Let's go back to the first point that um, uh, and that is Socrates' commitment, fundamental commitment to principle, and we've met that too in the Apology. Socrates essentially dies for a principle, and that principle then was the unexamined life is not a worthwhile life for human beings. That's on page 41 of Five Dialogues. But we meet other instances or examples of that, of Socrates' commitment to principle, and he talks about it actually very directly in the Crito, and the Crito, the situation in the Crito is that Socrates has been found guilty in the Apology. He's been sentenced to be executed. He's in jail, awaiting his execution, which is going to be pretty soon, apparently, at the time the Crito opens. One of Socrates, very good friends, and a contemporary of his about his age, whose name is Crito, comes in to break him out of jail. And I should mention here that nobody really wanted Socrates to die. In the Apology, everybody thought when it was time for Socrates, after he was found guilty, when it was time for him to give his counter punishment, what he would suggest for a punishment to his accusers' request for execution, it was thought that Socrates would ask for exile. And the Athenians would have been happy to grant him exile. Socrates did not do that. He sort of called their bluff and mocked them, even while he's saying he's not mocking them, but he was mocking them. And so the Athenians voted to execute him, but nobody really wanted it. And people, it is quite likely that most Athenians would have been very happy if Socrates broke out of jail and just left the city. I mean, they just, it would have been a much better outcome for them. I mean, as it is, 2,500 years later, we think of Athens, the city that convicted and executed Socrates. We think of Athens as the city that convicted and executed Socrates. It's not the kind of reputation you want, into the realms of history and time. So Socrates is facing execution. His friend Crito comes in to try to break him out of jail. And Crito knows Socrates very well. And Crito knows that Socrates does not do anything that is not based on acting on principles and acting on the right principles. So Crito is prepared with arguments to try to convince Socrates to break out of jail. I mean, imagine this, if you will. You're about to face execution in a couple days. Someone comes in to break you out of jail, and you know that there would be no problem with it. Nothing bad is going to happen. Many people want you to, and yet you are reluctant to break out of jail and avoid your execution. I mean, who would do that? Well, the answer is Socrates would do that, and the situation we must understand is particularly, particularly serious and particularly grave. Socrates is going to remain in jail and faces execution, and there's absolutely no question in his mind that during the trial or after the trial, that there's no question in his mind that maybe he was guilty, maybe he made a mistake, and he shouldn't have done what he did, which was to examine people. Maybe he should have chosen another line of work or defended himself in some other way. There's not a hint of that in Socrates in Socrates' sensibility, and so the situation is that. The situation is that Socrates is fully convinced that he has been indicted unjustly, he has been tried unjustly, he's been found guilty by the Athenians unjustly, he has been sentenced to death unjustly, and his execution will be unjust. I mean, every step of the way, the Athenians have treated him unfairly and unjustly. And he knows that. This is not, he's not going to try to convince anybody of anything else that maybe he made a mistake. He's there and unjustly will be executed unjustly. So one of the, maybe the main question is in the Crito, and I think it is the main question, is why does Socrates argue with Crito that it would be wrong for him to break out of jail, given especially that that Socrates knows and is convinced that he's been treated entirely unjustly, and yet he still argues that it would be the wrong thing for him to do. I mean, how do we make sense of that argument? It would be unjust. for Socrates to break out of jail, even though he has been treated unjustly. So Crito's up against the lot and here, and Crito knows that he's going to have to convince Socrates by good arguments to break out of jail. So they get in a conversation, and I'm not going to go through I'm not going to go through much of it actually, but on page 45, 46, 47, and 48, they have this, Crito and Socrates, they have this conversation where Crito is presenting arguments to Socrates that it's the right thing, that it would be just for Socrates to break out of jail. I mean, Crito knows that he's not going to convince Socrates, let's go, even though, you don't want to, it's bad that you die. Crito comes armed with arguments. They're not very good. Socrates kind of says that they're not very good. And then at the bottom of page 48, there's this wonderful passage where Socrates articulates what it is he is about. I mean, his invigorating principle. And he says at the bottom of page 48, he's just been arguing with Crito about whether to break out of jail. And Socrates says, bottom of page 48, he says, "My dear Crito, your eagerness to talk, Socrates to break out of jail, to convince him to break out of jail. My dear Crito, your eagerness is worth much if it should have some right aim. If not, then the greater your keenness, the more difficult it is to deal with. The greater your keenness to break me out of jail. We must therefore examine whether we should act in this way or not," meaning breaking out of jail. "We must therefore examine whether we should act this way or not, as not only now, but at all times I am the kind of man who listens to nothing within me but the argument that on reflection seems best to me. I cannot, now that this fate has come upon me, discard the arguments I used. They seem to be much the same. I value and respect the same principles as before. And if we have no better arguments to bring up at this moment, be sure that I shall not agree with you, not even if the power of the majority were to frighten us with more bogies, as if we were children, with threats of incarceration and execution and confiscation of property. How should we continue this matter? How should we examine this matter most reasonably?" What Socrates says here is that the only thing that matters to him is discovering the right principle or the right principles and acting according to it. I mean, this is such a wonderful passage. We must therefore examine whether we should act in this way or not, as not only now, but at all times, I am the kind of man who listens to nothing within me but the argument that on reflection seems best to me. I cannot, now that this fate has come upon me, discard the arguments I used. They seem to be much the same. I value and respect the same principles as before. So Socrates in the Crito is going to look for the principles that obligate him to remain in jail, even though he has been treated unjustly. So, in other words, even though he's been treated unjustly, Socrates is looking for a principle that would tell him and Crito that it would be unjust for him to break out of jail. And so the thing that I want to emphasize here is that is just Socrates' overwhelming commitment to principle. It's just key. We hear lots of time about people acting on principle. That's Socrates, okay? And there've been other people in history that have acted on principle, probably to this degree. I think of Martin Luther King Jr., I think of Gandhi, many others. So Socrates is in that line. So that's one of the main points I'm pushing for that you get in the Crito. The second point, as I said, is that the community is the source of identity. and you can see that in point A, I think it is on your sheet here, and this is a key point in the Crito, and it's contrary to what we understand as Americans about how we think about identity. And we probably think of it in a much different way, and we'll touch on that. But for Socrates, one of the things that he's going to argue is that the community is the source of our identity. And the argument's going to go, I mean, the principle that he's looking for is going to have something to do with the idea that if he breaks out of jail, and listens to Crito, he breaks out of jail unjustly, that he will be harming the community. And that is, he will be harming the foundation of his identity and the foundation, frankly, of everybody's identity. And so by breaking out of jail, Socrates will be harming really the most important thing in our lives, and that is what gives us life, what gives us our identity. And the part of that there is you've got the community, you've got Socrates and other individuals, and what connects them in Socrates' argument is that Socrates, by breaking out of jail, will be breaking an agreement with the community, and it's that agreement that obligates Socrates to remain in jail, and so in some general but important way, Socrates is saying that the principle that that he's going to be that he must follow is that when you come to a just agreement with someone, and that someone includes the community, when you come to a just agreement, you must keep your agreements, regardless of any other matters. So, I mean, particularly, and I don't want to diminish what Socrates is saying, this is probably my projection on it, but particularly if it's such a profound principle that it's the origin of who you are. Such an important principle as keeping your agreement. So what Socrates is going to say is that the individual and the community have come to an agreement. And essentially, Socrates' argument in the Crito is that he does certain things for the community, and as his part of the agreement, and the community, as its part of the agreement, does certain things for him. What does Socrates do for the community as his part of the agreement? Well, among other things, he follows its laws. He follows the judgments of its courts. He goes to defend his city. If the city, and by city we mean city-state. I mean, for the Greeks, the city was the fundamental community body, the way that our nations are. But so Socrates says we defend this fundamental community organism, and so Socrates says, part of the my part of the agreement is to follow its laws, accept its judgments, defend it when it asks me to, and do other things that are part of that agreement. For its part, then, the community, according to Socrates, does certain things for Socrates. And what it does for Socrates, essentially, is to give him and other individuals, is to provide for him the instruments of his identity. And I'm going to want to say that more strongly than just the instrument. It's not just the tools of his identity. In some fashion, it's the content of his identity. So the principle that Socrates is looking for is this principle that when we engage in a just agreement with someone, we must keep it. If we violate it, we're being unjust. We're acting unjustly towards that other person or towards that other body, including communities. So Socrates now, and actually our job is to fill in those parts of this agreement, to fill in parts of that argument. And one of the things that Socrates says, and let me actually draw you to the key page. Sort of barking around it, and I don't want this video to go on for 4 days, so let me get to it. The key page in the Crito for what we are looking at is page 53. And on page 53, Socrates, and actually it's Plato who's written this, Plato, Socrates, engages in this kind of extraordinary device where on page 53, Socrates has, and Plato through his writing of this, has Socrates engage with Crito as though the laws themselves were speaking with Socrates and Crito. And at the bottom of page, at the top of page 53, Socrates says that Socrates says to Crito, he says, and this is in the top, really the second sentence in there, Socrates says to Crito, they've been talking, and so Socrates says, then I state the next point, or rather I ask you, when one has come to an agreement that is just with someone, should one fulfill it or cheat on it? I mean, that's exactly what we've been talking about. When one has come to an agreement with someone that is just, should we fulfill it or should we cheat on it? And Crito says one should fulfill it. So you should keep your just agreements. And then Socrates says on page 53, he says, see what follows from this. If we leave here, meaning the jail, if we leave this jail, if we leave here without the city's permission, are we harming people whom we should least do harm to? And are we sticking to a just agreement or not? So what Socrates does first, he says, if we break our agreements, if we break our just agreements, are we doing something that's just or cheating on it? Crito quickly says, we're cheating on it, it's unjust. And then Socrates fills in what that agreement is. And in this particular instance, and what that agreement is that when, Socrates says, when the city and the individual come to a just agreement, and the individual is going to do something without the city's permission, is that legitimate? Is that just or not? And Crito can't answer. If we leave here, doesn't know how to answer. If we leave here without the city's permission, are we harming people whom we should least do harm to? And are we sticking to a just agreement or not? And Crito says, I cannot answer your question, Socrates. I don't know. It's kind of a tough question. It's a tough question because Crito probably sees where Socrates is going with this argument about not breaking out of jail. And Crito doesn't want Socrates to not break out of jail. He wants Socrates to break out of jail. So he's reluctant to go the path that Socrates is leading, and he may not quite understand fully what Socrates is saying. So now Socrates explains what's going on. And Socrates says to Crito on page 53, look at it this way. If, as we were planning to run away from here, or whatever one should call it, meaning breaking out of jail, the laws, and if as we were to break out of here, the laws in the state came and confronted us and asked, now these are the laws speaking to Socrates in Crito. Tell me, Socrates, the laws say, tell me, Socrates, what are you intending to do? Do you not by this action, breaking out of jail, do you not by this action you are attempting, intend to destroy us, the laws, and indeed the whole city, as far as you are concerned? Or do you think it possible for a city not to be destroyed if the verdicts of its courts have no force, but are nullified and set at naught by private individuals? Let me read that again. It's such an important point. For the entire history of political philosophy, it's an important point. But it's very important for this too. the laws say. Um, uh, Do not by this action you are attempting intend to destroy us, the laws, and indeed the whole city, as far as you are concerned. Or do you think it possible for a city not to be destroyed if the verdicts of its courts have no force, but are nullified and set at naught by private individuals? And Socrates then returns in his own voice and says, what shall we answer to this and other such arguments? For many things could be said, especially by an orator, on behalf of the laws we are destroying, of this law we are destroying, which orders that the judgments of the courts shall be carried out. What Socrates is saying here is so important because when you come to an agreement with the city, as Socrates is saying here, when you come to an agreement with the city, who judges? Essentially, he's asking who judges what the laws are and who judges when those laws are broken. And what Socrates is saying, is it the individual who judges when the laws are broken, or is it the city or its representatives expressing the will of the city that judges whether the laws are broken or whether the agreement is broken? Again, do you think it possible for a city not to be destroyed if the verdicts of its courts have no force but are nullified and set at naught by private individuals? Who makes the decision? So here's the example, and this is true of all law. Here's the example. Imagine you're driving down, I don't know, Interstate 90, okay, and you're going 85 miles an hour. A cop pulls you over and, walks up the car and says, you were breaking the speed limit, and I'm going to write you, a ticket. And you say, officer, in this part of I-90, the speed limit actually is 90 miles per hour. I'm the judge of what the speed limit is, and and individuals are the judges of what the speed limits are. And the speed limit in this section of I-90, I happen to believe, is 90 miles an hour. And so I was going 85, that's true, I'm not going to argue that, but I was actually going 5 miles underneath, below the speed limit, so you can't write me a ticket. I mean, think about that for a minute. If it was up to the individual to decide what the laws are and how they are applied and when they are applied, there would be no laws. Now, you might think that's a nice thing, and we could have a long conversation about that. But in fact, if there were no laws, which is exactly what would happen if individuals decided what the laws were or are, if there were no laws, we're talking more than chaos, okay? We're talking Hobbes's state of nature again. But I won't go into that. We're talking bad news. So what Socrates' point is that it's not up to the individual to decide what the laws are and how they are applied. It is up to the city. And one of the ways the city expresses what the laws are is through the judgments of its courts. Those are sanctioned by the city. They are the city and the laws essentially talking to individuals, as in this case. So the one thing that Socrates is going to establish is that, with Crito, is that when Socrates says if we break out of jail, we're going to be breaking our agreement with the city and its laws, and therefore harming the city in the way that we would do that by breaking its laws. When we break our agreement, it's not up to us what the agreement is, or to interpret that. It's up to the city, and that means it's up to the courts. And what Socrates is saying is that his trial, as unjust as he thought it was, still applies. It was the expression of the city and its laws, and that is the proper body for deciding, the proper organism for deciding what the laws are and how they apply. So they've been through that court. They've been through that. Socrates has been found guilty. He's been sentenced to die. At some level, he has to accept that as the agreement. So if he breaks the agreement, he's going to be harming the city. It's not up to him to decide what that agreement is and how it's applied. So on one side of the agreement, we have Socrates saying, the individual's part is to follow the laws, which means accepting the verdict of its courts. The part of the individual in Socrates' agreement is to fight for the city, defend it. It's to benefit the city in whatever way he can. And that's Socrates' side of the agreement. So that's his part of the bargain. But the city also has its part of the bargain. And I mean, it is an agreement. It's not just that the city can arbitrarily do what it wants. There is something that the city fulfills and what it does. And that is the key, what the city does, that is the key to this idea that the source, that the community is the source of identity. Essentially, for its part of the bargain, Socrates follows the laws, accepts the judgments of its courts, goes to defend it. For its part of the bargain, the city does things, gives individuals the instruments of their identity. Now, what do we mean by that? I mean, how does the community give Socrates his identity? Well, Socrates says that on page 53. It's the next long passage. It's the next passage. And Socrates says, he says, page 53, he's talking about the agreement that he's made with the city to Crito. Crito still wants him to break out of jail. And I'll read the last part of that I've read quickly on 53 in the first paragraph. He says, Socrates, for many things could be said, especially by an orator on behalf of this law we are destroying by breaking out of jail, which orders that the judgments of the courts shall be carried out. Shall we say in answer, the city wronged me, and its decision was not right? Shall we say that, or what? So the city treated me unjustly, but shall we say, well, you've treated me unjustly, now I'm going to treat you unjustly by breaking out of jail? Crito, who very much wants Socrates to leave, says, yeah, that's it. Crito says, yes, by Zeus, Socrates, that is our answer. Let's go. But Socrates says then, what if the laws said? He comes back to Socrates. He comes back to this idea of the laws talking to Socrates himself and Crito. So Socrates says on page 53, then what if the law said, was that the agreement between us, Socrates, or was it to respect the judgments that the city came to, the judgments of court that the city came to? Then Socrates in his own voice says, and if we wondered, Crito and he, if we wondered at their words, they would perhaps add, laws speaking again, Socrates, do not wonder what we say, but answer, since you are accustomed to proceed by question and answer. Come now, what accusation do you bring against us and the city, that you should try to destroy us by breaking out of jail? The laws try to destroy us, the laws, by breaking out of jail. Listen now to what the laws in the city are responsible for, what their part of the agreement is. Did we, the laws not, first bring you to birth? And was it not through us, the laws, that your father married your mother and begat you? Tell us, do you find anything to criticize in those of us who are not concerned with marriage? And I would say that I do not criticize them. Or in those of us, the laws concerned with the nurture of babies and the education that you too received? Were those assigned to that subject not right to instruct your father, to educate you in the arts and in physical culture? And I would say that they were right. Very well, the laws would continue. And after you were born and nurtured and educated, could you, in the first place, deny that you are our offspring and servant, both you and your forefathers? If that is so, do you think that we are on an equal footing as regards the right, and that whatever we, the laws, do to you, it is right for you to do to us? You are not on an equal footing as with your father as regards the right, nor with your master if you had one, so as to retaliate for anything they did to you, to revile them if they reviled you, to beat them if they beat you, and so on with many other things. Do you think you have the right to retaliation against your country and its laws? That if we undertake to destroy you and think it right to do so, you can undertake to destroy us, the laws, and the city as far as you can in return. So what Socrates is saying, this is really the major part that I want to get at, is that in return, the part of the bargain that's the city or the nations, it's part of the agreement. Socrates follows the laws, accepts the judgments of his courts, defends it if it asks him, and a number of other things. That's his part of the bargain. The part of the bargain, the part of the agreement that the city keeps is that it provides his identity. It creates his identity. It gives him the instruments of identity. What are those instruments? The laws say in this, speaking of the laws to Socrates and Crito, the laws say, we protect your birth, we ensure your birth, we nurture you, we give you an education, we provide your education, we provide for your parents in your marriage, we give you your life, we give you your identity. And so if Socrates is arguing here, if Socrates breaks out of jail, he will be harming the body that is that has provided his and that provides his and others' identity. He will be destroying that as much as possible. So, with enough of that kind of law breaking, there goes the source of people's identity. Now let's look at what the city is saying. I mean, what the laws are saying, what Socrates and Plato are actually saying here, and that is, they're saying that they provide Socrates' identity. They protect and ensure his birth. They nurture him. They educate him. They protect his and his parents' marriage, many other things. So let's look at this. So one of the things that the laws say is that they protect and provide for Socrates' birth. Well, how is that possible? How are we to think of that? Why is the community? How is the community involved in providing Socrates' birth here, or protecting his birth? We think of birth as being between two people. We think of it as being between the woman and the fetus, the woman and the baby, the woman and the husband. Maybe it's three people. That's how we think of who's involved in the birth of someone. It's the woman and the baby, and the husband. So how does the community come into there? Well, the community, in ways that are kind of invisible to us, and much of this, unfortunately, is kind of invisible to us, but in ways that are kind of invisible to us, the community ensures our birth. So one way is that it ensures our the birth of infants, and since that's where we all come from, it ensures our birth, is by providing health care for the mother and providing health care for and general care for the infant that is born. Every community has, in some fashion, ancient or modern, every community has somehow provided for the births of infants and provided for the health of the mother. And that is the community. And in some communities, infants, when they're born, are taken from the mother and raised by a community group. I mean, the mother doesn't even deal with them very much, or at least is only one in dealing with them. And so the infant gets kind of 24-hour care, if you can put it in that way, provided by many people. We obviously have modern health care facilities. I will point to the fact that, though, if you look at infant mortality rates from country to country, you will see them vary radically. Unfortunately, even though the United States is one of the most highly developed countries on the planet in terms of technology, and I don't mean to be overly political here, but our healthcare system is not good. It doesn't function well. Other countries' healthcare systems function much better. They care for everyone, connected to a job or not, and you see this in infant mortality rates. And you don't have to go far for it. If you are an American infant born in Buffalo in the United States, your chance of not surviving your infancy, while it's small, is actually numbers of times greater not surviving your infancy born in Buffalo than if it's born in Toronto or a city along the southern border of Canada. Their healthcare system, whatever you've heard, frankly, their healthcare system is much better, and one of the places you see that is in the infant mortality rates. Now, that's a complicated statistic. It can be unpacked in various ways. That is one way to unpack it. That by most healthcare experts is not controversial, and I don't want to get into that. But you do see a tremendous variation in the health of the infant who is born, to a woman, and that and there's they're fairly constant. I mean, it's not like you see the infant mortality rates in Buffalo go up and down and up and down and medium. They stay relatively constant. The same is true in Toronto. The infant mortality rate stays at a certain level. It doesn't go up and down, and it's predictable. And it's just a very interesting feature of societies, because communities are involved with who we are. I mean, involved very strongly. So when and by the way, just to skirt along the politics here, this has nothing to do with abortion. Okay, I mean, you can get these figures without abortion rates and without the abortion laws at all. I mean, you can see all this. I mean, you can go in a direct where you, if you want to use abortion, you can to find this, but you don't have to. There's other ways of parsing that out, and anything else I say will get me far down a very controversial and political road. So I'll avoid it. I'm saying it just to acknowledge it and move along. But you see that communities are involved in the birth of people, of human beings. The one of the next things that Socrates says is that the community, as he says on page 53, do we not, meaning the laws, do we not first bring you to birth? And was it not through us, the laws, that your father married your mother and begat you? Tell us, do you find anything to criticize in those of us who are concerned with marriage? So one of the things that the laws in the city mentions that is involved in our identity is marriage, and how we define marriage, and the protections that come with marriage. We think of marriage in this country as being between two individuals. Mostly two individuals. There actually are variations in our own country, but we think of it as being between two individuals. We have, and just to note this again, it's, I suppose, controversial in our community. Who we define as being allowed legally to get married. We've traditionally thought of a man and a woman. We have changed it recently and recognize and acknowledge men and women can be married. And that's a legal definition. whatever you may think of it. It's a legal definition, and it's recognized legally at this point. And that defines marriage. That defines who can express themselves in certain kinds of relationships. And that involves the community. But there are other more subtle, even protections or engagements of the community in marriage. One of those is how, and this is a traditional man-woman marriage from some years ago, but not that long, 60 years ago, maybe 70, certainly before that, and even a little after that. It used to be that the part of the definition of marriage in the United States was that the woman was the property of the man, and the man could dispose of and dispense of the woman, his wife, the way that he saw fit, and that went up to and included murder and other kinds of violence. It was a domestic affair, and the legal authorities would frequently not intervene. It's a domestic affair. The fact that your husband is beating you up is no concern of the community. That has changed radically right now, thank goodness. But that was the definition of marriage. Imagine being in a partnership, a legally recognized partnership, where your partner could legally beat the living daylights out of you and perhaps kill you and your children and his children and have no legal recourse. Imagine how you would differ in your mind. Imagine how you would think of yourself, because we're talking ultimately about individual identity here, that the community creates the individual. I can put it that way. The community is the source of individual identities. Imagine how the structure of your individual identity would be different if you could enter a partnership where you could be, where you could have the daylights beaten out of you, or if you could be the one who would beat the daylights out of another person without legal recourse. I mean, that was part of the male's identity also, that they could do that. So you think of that. Whatever we may say about the goodness or badness of that setup, it certainly was a different way of thinking about who we are or who we were as individuals. So that's one aspect that has changed. I also want to though mention here that we in our in our country for a number of years, but not forever, we believe that that two people get married because they're in love, and what brings them together and what sanctifies at some level their marriage is their love for one another, and that partnership is a product of and an expression of love. And so we believe that individuals choose each other as individuals to form a couple, and we form that couple. And it's legally recognized as a marriage with certain kinds of protections and benefits. So in other cultures, that is not the case. Many other cultures, and some parts of ours for a long time, recognized that, or have the establishment where marriages between two people are arranged by the family. And by the family, I mean the elders in the family. Parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, they're the ones that set you up with your partner. And it comes to some mutual agreement among the families. You, as an individual, do not have anything to say about it. You may not like it, and there's all sorts of arguments about this that are quite interesting. You may not like it, but that's the way it is. It's arranged. You accept it. You go on with it. Now, I don't want to get into the weeds with that particular aspect of arranged marriages, but I do want to, well, let me for a minute, come to think of it. Imagine that you're growing up in a culture where you as an individual are going to be defined in your identity as a little child, knowing that you will, as a small child, knowing that you will end up in an arranged marriage. Now, you're not comparing it to cultures where you can select your mate. That's not there. I mean, people in cultures where there are arranged marriages broadly, widely accept that. Maybe less so because of the comparison and other complications, but you accept that. The point is, you're different as an individual if you grow up in a culture where you are going to enter into an arranged marriage as both partners to that couple, the man and the woman. You're both arranged into it. You both have a different idea of yourselves growing up. Now, one of the things I want to point to here is that, and let me say it like this, and this is point C on the sheet that I've given you. We get to that. Socrates and Plato are saying that there is no given self. We are not some independent, individuated, individual self independently of our community. It's not like we have some, identity bar in our heads or in our minds that we are born with. It's not like I have some Neil thing in me that's Neil, and you have something in you that's Nancy or that's Jeff or that's Herbert or whomever. And that is that there's no given self, and that is we get ourselves, we get our identities from the communities, and that is to say, in this point C, there is no given self, meaning social relations are internal to and constitutive of individual identity. We internalize the social relations that we are engaged with. And the reason I'm bringing this up now, is because it's illustrated what I'm talking about. But if you grow up in a culture where you are going to be a partner in an arranged marriage, it's not that the arranged marriage is laid over some other structure that's already there. It's that you grow up internally with the idea of arranged marriages. You think of yourself coupling in that way. And so that just becomes the way you look at the world. And it is the way that you look at the world. Thinking of something else, thinking of something other, is almost unimaginable. And I would say this strongly enough that we grow up in a world where our community thinks of marriages as being a product of individual expression, but that is itself an expression of the community. The fact that we think of ourselves as individuals making marriages as an expression of individual love and emotion for each other, that comes from the community. And so people in arranged marriages think of themselves internally. It's their identity. It is as unimaginable to them as making a selection out of love of a mate as it is to us making or having a selection made for us by the community, by our family. This is the way that we think of our identities, because they are constituted by our social relations. And one of the other, and one of the instances, one of the examples I would use of this is, in terms of arranged marriages, think of growing up in a community with arranged marriages, and so you go through childhood and adolescence, knowing that you're going to be in an arranged marriage. It's your nature to think of yourself that way. Think of what happens to what we in our culture identify as adolescence. Adolescence in our culture, starting at 12 or 11 or 13, somewhere around there, going through, probably the early 20s at least, if not beyond that. we think of adolescence in our culture as preparing ourselves to become attractive, to be selected by some other mate that we select. And so we go through these tremendous, I want to call them rituals, and so I guess I will. We go through these tremendous rituals and behaviors of making ourselves attractive. And so think of now growing up in a community where attraction, making yourself attractive, is not, in order to attract a mate, a spouse, is not the primary concern of an 8 or 10 or 11-year period in your life. You're going to have a mate, you're not going to have much say in it, neither is he or she, and that's just the way it is. So attraction, being attractive in that way. Now, there's other aspects of that we could go down. I don't want to get into that. But if you think of it in those ways, one of the dominant features in our community is making yourself attractive. Well, imagine what happens in an arranged marriage community. Imagine what happens to the cosmetic industry and the clothing industry compared to ours. It's entirely different. The cosmetic and clothing industry is entirely different in a culture that has arranged marriages as opposed to a culture that has a marriages of selection. Okay, so you think of that. I mean, imagine how much time our adolescents goes into making ourselves attractive to someone else, and shopping and buying and looking in the mirror and fussing and crimping and so on. All that is different. It's not that it entirely disappears. There are aspects of this, and there are cosmetics in other cultures, but they are used for different purposes. They have different meanings. It's not it's not sexuality, it's not love, it's not even necessarily individuality. So think of how different your individuality, your idea of who you are as an individual is, as a person is, when you grow up in a culture that is built on arranged marriages. And my point here is just to say that social relations are internalized, and we look at the world the way our society imprints on us. And I don't mean it entirely as just a stamping, as a molding with nothing else there. Okay, no individual aspects at all, and that's a complicated path. I want to avoid that for the moment, but it is there. But nothing like we think of it in our culture. And so marriage, when Socrates and the laws say, we begat you through, we aided you, part of the agreement was to give you your marriage. The community is absolutely involved in marriages, in who can get married, how they get married, the treatment of each person, what marriages look like, who takes care of the infants, of the children, how they're taken care of. I mean, it's from the inside out, or I should say it's from the outside in to the outside. That's how that works. The other example that Socrates uses here, and I know this is very long, I apologize, we're almost at 60 minutes, but I want to get through this. It's so incredibly important. The other example that Socrates uses here when the laws are talking to him is that he says on page 53, tell us, do you find anything to criticize in those of us, the laws, who are concerned with marriage? And Socrates says, I would say that I do not criticize them. And the laws continue, and those of us concerned with the nurture of babies and the education that you two received. So Socrates talks about education. The community is involved in education. Well, maybe education is the clearest example of how the community is involved and engaged in who we are. And let me put it in some straightforward, simple way. We get education because we want to be different individuals. And we know that we are being different individuals. You come to take a course in a college, and I'm aware that at some level you have no say in education, before the age of 16 in our country. But when you go on to take education, to get a higher education, and what's happening in your lower grades of education, the other grades, is that you are being made into an individual. You come to college because you want to be different. You want to have different skills. You want to have different possibilities. You want to have different capacities. That's how. That's why you do that. And so education is fundamental for making us who we are, and we know that. We know it's in. It's from the outside in. We want what people have outside, and we want to make that our own so that we can be different. So that we can become a different individual. We want that skill. We want that knowledge. We want that ability, and that will make us into someone else. And we choose that. We don't think of it in that way, perhaps, but perhaps we should. And I would also say that the community is, through education, is certainly involved. The community chooses what to teach. It chooses who to teach. It chooses how much, or it determines how much people are going to pay for their education. I don't want to make this seem like I'm bashing the United States, but we do have very expensive education. Canada, and I only use Canada because I know it. I lived there for 5 years, and so I know it better than other countries. But it's true of many other countries. Higher education and college and university education in Canada is much less expensive. The communities pay, the provinces and the federal government of Canada pay much more towards individuals' education than we do in this country. And the educations are not secondary. I mean, they're wonderful educations. I've been there. I know. You may disagree seeing me and how I'm teaching. You may think, oh, Canada really messed Neil up. They must have inferior education. But their education, that might be me. But the educations are quite wonderful in Canada. And they're much less money. And what that means is many more people can get an education who want them. They have secondary and higher educations, vocational education that is heavily invested by the community. They have many other alternatives. And one of the other aspects of that is that Canadians don't borrow anywhere near as much money as Americans do. So if you've borrowed a lot of money, you know this already. I'm not giving you bad news right now that you don't know. If you borrow a lot of money, you will be paying that money off for many, many, many years. I hope you get a good job. And a lot of times, the money that you borrow for your education to become a different person prevents you from buying a home, which frankly would also make you into a different person. And home loans are also guaranteed by the community. They're guaranteed by the government, the loans that you get, so they can't be ripped out from underneath you. But that's, well, it's not another story. It's another aspect of the same story. But the idea is that the monies that are involved in our education will affect us in many ways for the rest of our lives. The point is that what Socrates is saying is that the community is the source of our identity. If you change the community, you change the identity. And let me make that point in sort of moving into perhaps another step here, and that is that Socrates and Plato believe that, and this is my interpretation of their belief, I think it's pretty accurate, but if you grew up in if you were born or raised in another community, and you had the exact same DNA, you would be an entirely different person. You would be so different that you wouldn't recognize your present self if your other community self bumped into you on the street. You would look different. You would dress differently. You would weigh differently. You would eat differently. You would probably have different gestures. You would, depending on the communities, have different language, and that shapes you. If you grew up in France or China or Africa or Colombia, wherever, or Canada, wherever, or Norway, wherever you grew up, if you were born and raised there, you would be, well, same family, but they were all raised there too. You would be an entirely different person. We get our identities from our communities, and we can say that even more sharply. We get our identities from the groups that we are members of, and this gets us into what I've noted as D on this, the important points about the Crito. We get our identity from the groups that we are members of, and the groups are underwritten and structured by the larger community, but we get our identities from the groups that we are members of. And so, and the reason that you and I are different, it's not just because I'm probably much older than you. It's because I'm a product of different groups. Some of it has to do with age, obviously, but some of it, and some of what has to do with age, has to do with my exposure to groups that you are not exposed to. So the wonderful music that I love, and the terrible music that you love, that's probably a product of my age. But that's exposure to different groups when I was growing up. That formed me. So we get who we are from the different groups that we are members of, and I mean by that all kinds of groups, family, and I mentioned this on this piece that I've handed out. Families, friends, schools, the music that we are exposed to, the technologies, which also has to do with different groups of people, neighborhood, socioeconomic status. All of those are groups that are aspects of the community. So let me take an example. Let me take an example. I hope that's going to be instructive, and that not talking too much about myself. One of the things I think that that people note me for as an individual is my sense of humor, and you just got a taste of it when I made my smart mouth comment about the music that I love and the music that you love being hateable. Okay, that's expression of my humor, and that's pretty individualistic. My humor, even though it defines me in many ways as an individual, I attribute my humor, when you ask me, well, Neil, where did you get that sense of humor? I actually attribute it to my family, but I also attribute it to my religion. I have what is considered to be a very Jewish sense of humor. It's aggressive, it's self-deprecating, it's sarcastic, it's other-deprecating. It's just kind of a no-holds-barred sense of humor, and it's a particular kind of humor. My humor does not come from stories. It does not come from necessarily. Now I do have Jewish friends who do this, but my family didn't do this. And most of my Jewish friends actually are kind of like me. My humor does not come from telling a setup line and then a punchline like that. It comes from the sort of the exchange, the interchange between individuals as it's happening. But that's my sister's sense of humor. If you ran into my sister, and I only have the one sibling, she's 5 years older. If you ran into her not knowing that it was me, that it was it's not me. If you ran into her not knowing it was my sister, you would think to yourself within probably a minute and a half, wow, her humor is very much like Neil's. Her humor is very similar to mine. Aggressive, self-deprecating, sarcastic, kind of nonstop, probably rolls over into the inappropriate occasionally, for which she and I both have to apologize. It's very similar. my father had a great sense of humor, and my mother was sort of the audience. But it comes from that. If you listen to Jewish humor, you will find a remarkable similarity with my humor. If you, gosh, a lot of these are old Jewish comedians, many of whom are dead. But Woody Allen's humor is mine is very similar to his, and you'll see an identity with that. If you want to be frightened, you can Google Don Rickles. Is I have similarities in my humor to his. His is very Jewish humor. And there are a bunch of other people whose names I've now forgotten, but I will remember when this is eventually done in 4 days, this video. See, that's a self-deprecating humor. There it is. So my Jewish humor, which seems to be very individual for me, is actually from a number of groups: my family, my religion, some other influences in that. If you compare my sense of humor, or Jewish sense of humor, for instance, to British humor, those of you who know Monty Python, British humor is it's totally different. It's totally wacky and goofy. And not that mine's not wacky and goofy, but British humor it's full on wacky, goofy stuff. There's Irish humor. There's African American humor. There's Italian humor. I mean, it's just there's you look at it, and I'm talking about ethnicities and groupings, but they're sort of primary groupings. They're cultures. Many of them are countries, and so many of them are nations. So the point is that we get who we are as individuals from the groups that we are members of. And it's not that we come together as individuals with some individual implanted in us and form groups. It's that we're the groups first, and the individual identities that we have are expressions of them. And the reason that you and I are different are not because we have some different, identity bar placed into us. It's because our group memberships are different and very different. I've put on this sheet that I've given you sort of a grid, and I've put a dot on the grid with an arrow that says me, and a dot on the group with an arrow at a different part of the grid that says you, and that is just those grid lines are really meant to be lines of group formation and interaction. They're sort of vectors of what groups we've interacted with and how that has resulted in our different identities. So you and I are different because, in some obvious ways, we grew up in a different time, for sure. But we have different families. We probably have different religions, or we very possibly could have different religions. We have different cities that we live in. Even people of my ilk are different depending on what cities they grow in. I mean, I know, I have Jewish relatives that grew up in different cities, and they're different than I am because of the impact of the city. And I know this, I can see it. There's a similarity. And I think it's a defining similarity. It's not better, it's not worse. It's just a similarity, and it's a difference. And it's because we are the product of different group memberships. Now, I do want to emphasize, it's not that we're talking about a mathematical result. You can't take up the different groups that we're members of and add them up and get Neil, or get Bobby Sue, or get Ellen, or get Johnny, or get Davy. I mean, you can't just add them up. We do have some room of movement in there, but even that room of movement that we have, and it is real movement, it is probably some real ability to select certain things and not others. but that also has some relationship to the groups that we get into, that we spring from, that are our sources. So, okay, let me try to conclude this. It's very long. It's almost 2 hours long. I apologize for that, but I couldn't help myself. Is it 2 hours long? No, it's not 2 hours long. It's about 75 minutes long. So it's, the length of a regular class. So the point with Socrates is, why does he not break out of jail when Crito comes to break him out of jail? I've said because he's looking for a principle that will tell him what to do. And the principle is that he can't break his agreement with the community, given that it is a just, a righteous agreement. If he breaks his agreement with the community, it will be harming the community as much as is in his power. And that agreement has to do with the fact, I think, that Socrates, for his part of the bargain, accepts the judgments of its courts, follows its laws, the community's laws, goes to defend it when it has to. He benefits it in other ways that he believes contributes to it. That's his part of the agreement. The community's part of the agreement is to give him his identity. He is the instrument. The community is the instrument, or provides the instruments for his identity. And the community, it should be noted, is there before him. It will be there after him. He is born into the community, and in the process of growing up, he internalizes the structures of the community, whether those structures are about birth, marriage, education, nurturance. Nurturance is what the community provides for us, like the way I think of this as, and I didn't talk about it, is as a sort of informal but community aspects: swimming pools, parks, recreation areas. Who looks out for whom? Police and so on. It nurtures us in those ways. So the community provides the instruments of our identity. So if Socrates breaks his agreement, he will be harming the community in its ability to provide identities. And he has accepted, and let me put it this way and shorten this a bit, he does have arguments about it. Socrates has accepted his community, the identity that his community has given him up to the time that he's in jail and is about to be executed. And so he basically says, now, I've never moved from Athens, I've hardly ever left Athens, I've given every implied acknowledgement that I accept my part of the agreement and I accept what it's given for me. But now that the community, which has the right of decision, now that the community decides against me, and I had my opportunity to persuade it, on page 54 he says, I had my opportunity to persuade it in the trial to see it my way, and it didn't. Now that I didn't persuade it and it goes against me, is it just for me to break out of jail and harm the community? And Socrates says, I think not. It would be unjust for me to violate my agreement with the community. The big principle is the agreement he has with his community. The content of that principle is that the community is the source of his identity. If you want to read this and get a better idea of it, or the same aspect, page 53 and page 54 are the major parts of that. And if you sort of follow through that, you'll get the idea. All right, I'm going to end this now. I think I've gotten out pretty much what I wanted to get out. Let me just say one last reminder, and that is the idea, that the very important idea that that there's no given self, that social relations constitute, they structure our identity from the inside out, or as I've said, it's from the outside in to the outside. We're born into a community, it structures who we are, and that varies per community. Each different community, whether they live 1,000 miles from you, or 2 miles from you. There are different communities, every little way around, northern Ohio. Every different community has a different way of structuring your identity internally. You are different depending on what community you are born and raised in and mature in. Social relations are internal to our individual identities. Thank you very much. Peace.